Hey everybody, it's Ruby here today, and today I wanted to do a book review on The Man in the High Castle by Philip K. Dick. I'm using a different kind of camera, so just let me know what your thoughts are on this camera, or if it's really any different than the previous one that I had. This is actually on my phone. I didn't buy a whole new camera for it, but my last cell phone was so old that the camera really wasn't up to date, and this one I think might be better than my point and shoot, so we'll see. Anyways, The Man in the High Castle by Philip K. Dick. This is a book that has recently become a TV series. Now, I only watched a little bit of the first episode, so I can't talk too much about how much has changed or stayed the same for the TV show, but I will discuss it a little bit at the end. Otherwise, this is just a good old book review. So this is an alternative history science fiction novel that kind of speculates as to what would have happened if the Axis of Evil had won World War II instead of the Allied forces. So instead of Russia and America splitting up Germany into East and West Germany, instead you have the Japanese and Germans splitting up America into their respective territories. So you follow the different characters who are affected by this, but the interesting thing about Philip K. Dick is that unless it is explicitly about a specific technology or way of living, the atmosphere isn't actually what is the main part of this book. Instead, it's about their own specific worlds and experiences within the world. So nobody's really kind of trying to fight the system. There's no dystopian sort of worldview in this. It's not like an adventure book. It's actually very similar to what like a general fiction book would be about, but instead this one takes place in a more of a dictatorship, I guess. So generally, it's really hard to follow the characters of this book. I honestly couldn't probably name most of them right now. He doesn't really introduce the characters, and he doesn't reintroduce characters because there's a lot of them and he'll alternate back and forth between the chapters. And so we really have to read this in one go or in 1 week in order to fully understand it. And I read it in like 3 months. So I was definitely picking up on bits and pieces. And I don't think I really lost anything in terms of his narrative, but it was definitely harder to sort of get into it. So with that vein, all of the characters sort of interact with each other in different sort of ways, and they are all part of this particular supply chain for either selling antiques or creating antiques or, reinforcing the police presence around forgeries, as well as some higher-ups and sort of their political misgivings. One common thread in this book is that most of the characters know about or have read an alternative history fiction book of their own, which basically speculates what would happen if the Allied forces had won instead of the Axis of Evil. So it's basically the counterpart to this book and sort of how their lives change when they read this, which I thought was super interesting. And what I think is also interesting is that in the snippets of some of the book about the Allied forces, some of it's actually wrong, so it's not like they're reading about us. They're kind of reading about what an author at that particular time would think would have happened. So some of it is super accurate and some of it isn't really. And the person who wrote it is actually called the Man in the High Castle. That's what he calls himself. So one character goes to visit him, but he plays a very small role. It's almost as though his role is more about having people question their truth than it has anything to do with himself explicitly, which is, I think, a little bit meta. It's a little bit about maybe what Philip K. Dick thinks of himself. I'm not really sure, but I thought it was just an interesting addition to the book. And so that ties into the general theme of the book, which is about sort of reality and identity and sort of authenticity. So how much is true and how much matters in that truth. If you can get away with having the same sort of experiences with something that isn't super authentic, does that mean that it isn't authentic? So that happens with forgeries and with antiques, where one collector will collect antiques and sell them, and someone will actually be creating those antiques because they're just so rare and so many people love them that they've just started to create them instead, and to hold on to a certain amount of American history that was lost when they lost the war. And so this is the case when one of the characters starts creating jewelry of their own, and sort of what happens when people experience like an artwork that is made from love rather than from some sort of copy. Another theme is the I Ching, which is a Chinese sort of mystic, prophetic way of understanding what's happening in the world. And so that is referred to by most of the characters in this book. But what's really interesting is that Philip K. Dick either doesn't wish to put meaning into his books, or maybe he's just didn't really think ahead of time for what he was writing or something along those lines. But the I Ching I found wasn't actually something that had a specific meaning to it. So other than being in the same line of, you know, people now probably wouldn't necessarily believe in the I Ching, that doesn't mean that it doesn't hold truth for some people, and that's generally any sort of religion. So that was a particular interesting point as well, but it was interesting in the fact that it was almost misplaced in the book altogether. You will have noticed that I will not have mentioned plot, and the reason that I did not mention plot is because there really wasn't a plot. It was almost like little snippets of short stories, which was probably the case. My dad, who suggested this book to me, had mentioned that Philip K. Dick really likes to mix together a lot of his short stories. He was basically writing just to earn money, and so he was writing all the time, very prolifically, and just trying to get things done in order to make money. And so there's a chance that he might have just like added a whole bunch of short stories together into one book, and that's what it kind of feels like here. So even though there is common threads of particularly authenticity in the I Ching and of the history surrounding these characters, there isn't really an over-encompassing plot of them coming together. There isn't really a satisfying ending, and there isn't any sort of like climax, particularly at the end of the book. So definitely a very interesting and very different way of reading. It's very almost claustrophobic and chaotic to read this particular kind of book. But actually very satisfying to read because there's some amazing passages that sort of jolt you in the moment of making you feel like slightly introspective regarding sort of what the characters are going through. So I thought that that was really cool. Overall, I'd probably give this like a 3 out of 5. Oh, maybe a 4 out of 5. This one's really hard to tell. And even when I was talking to my dad about it, who like knows a lot more about Philip K. Dick, I had a really hard time of fully summarizing or describing my feelings around it, or even like describing sort of what I would change or keep the same, because it is a very chaotic book and it is something that I think is worth reading, but I don't find that it fits into a lot of other books that I've read, so it's really hard to make any sort of comparison to anything else. So if you like Philip K. Dick, if you like speculative fiction or history or even some sort of Japanese culture, which is definitely mixed into this, I would definitely suggest this. But it is still particularly pulp fiction, so you're not missing out on any sort of high-end literature by reading that. As for the TV series, I didn't really get into it. A friend of mine started playing it, and I was like, hey, I'm reading this book, you know, way off in the distance when I first started it. And I found the TV series to be actually pretty irritating in terms of how it's created, just because of the characters in it. It's very much like a drama-filled show, a lot of really hot 20-year-olds playing these science fiction adventurers. And maybe it changed after the first episode, but I find that Philip K. Dick's characters to actually be a lot grimier, a lot more like middle-aged, hard done by people, almost like Blade Runner. So to have this shiny TV series very much felt inauthentic, which I thought was a little bit ironic. So I think it's going to be one of those things where I'm not against the TV series. I didn't watch enough of it to really know if it gets better, but if you have read the book and you're interested about the TV series, I honestly would just warn you that it could be very much not like the book. Very much not like the book. So anyways, that was my book review. I hope you liked it. And see, I'm back on schedule a little bit. Missed last week, but that had more to do with bad planning than anything else. And I have a couple more videos for you later this week. So thanks for watching. Comment down below if you've watched the TV show or read the book or what your thoughts are on Philip K. Dick. And I will talk to you later. Bye.